The Last Good Summer. Chapter 1. The letter arrived on a Thursday, which seemed appropriate somehow. Thursdays had always been Margaret's day for receiving news, good, bad, or otherwise. It was a Thursday when she learned about the promotion at the bank, 42 years ago. A Thursday when they'd called about David's accident. And now, this Thursday in late September, with the maple outside her kitchen window just beginning to turn, here came another envelope that would change everything. She held it up to the light streaming through the window, squinting without her reading glasses. The return address was from a law office in Beaufort, South Carolina, a town she hadn't thought about in 6 decades. Well, she said aloud to the empty kitchen. She'd been talking to herself more since Harold passed, and saw no reason to stop. The silence in the house needed filling somehow, and her own voice was better than the constant drone of cable news. Margaret set the envelope on the counter beside her coffee cup, the one with the chipped rim that Harold had always meant to throw away but never did. She stared at it while she finished her toast. The envelope seemed to pulse with possibility, or maybe that was just her imagination running wild again. That's what happened when you lived alone at 78. Your mind filled in the empty spaces with whatever drama it could conjure. She thought about calling her daughter Linda, but it was barely 7 in the morning in Colorado. Besides, Linda would just worry, would insist on knowing what the letter said before Margaret had even opened it. Linda meant well, but she'd turned into the parent somewhere along the way, and Margaret into the child. The cat, Mr. Whiskers, a name she'd never chosen but had somehow stuck after the grandkids visited, wound between her ankles. He was the color of marmalade and had shown up on her porch 2 winters ago, half-starved and missing part of an ear. Now he acted like he owned the place. "What do you think?" she asked him. "Should I open it?" Mr. Whiskers meowed, which she took as encouragement. The envelope opened easily, no struggle with arthritic fingers this time. Inside was a single sheet of expensive-looking paper and a smaller, older envelope, yellowed with age. Margaret recognized the handwriting on the older envelope immediately, even though she hadn't seen it in 60 years. Her hand trembled. The letter from the law office was brief and professional. "Dear Mrs. Fletcher, I am writing to inform you that my client, James Robert Calloway, passed away on August 12th of this year. In accordance with his final wishes, I am delivering to you the enclosed letter, which Mr. Calloway entrusted to our firm in 1965 with specific instructions." But Margaret had stopped reading. She was staring at the older envelope, at the name written in fading blue ink, Maggie. Nobody had called her Maggie in 60 years. Nobody except Jimmy Calloway. She sat down heavily in the kitchen chair, the one that faced the backyard where Harold's tomato garden had been. The garden was overgrown now, gone wild with weeds and volunteer sunflowers. She'd meant to clear it, but somehow couldn't bring herself to erase that last piece of him. The envelope with her old name on it seemed to burn in her hands. She thought about that summer in Beaufort, the summer she turned 18 and believed the world was full of nothing but possibility. The summer before everything got decided. Before her father put his foot down, before she came back north to marry Harold, before she became the person she'd been for the last 60 years, before she stopped being Maggie and became Margaret. Mr. Whiskers jumped onto the table, something she normally wouldn't allow, and headbutt her hand. She scratched behind his good ear absently, her mind somewhere else entirely. Somewhere hot and humid, where the ocean smelled like salt and freedom, where a boy with dark hair and darker eyes had promised her things that seemed possible back then. The clock on the wall ticked forward. Outside, a school bus rumbled past, too early for the high schoolers, probably the elementary route. Life continuing its normal rhythm while Margaret sat holding a letter from a ghost. She thought about not opening it. She could throw it away right now, maintain the life she'd built, the memories she'd kept carefully contained in that small box in the back of her mind labeled, "The Summer I Don't Think About." But even as she thought it, she knew she was lying to herself. She'd been lying to herself for 60 years, pretending that summer didn't matter, that the choice she'd made, or that had been made for her, was the only one possible. Her fingers, steadier now, slipped under the seal of the old envelope. The paper inside was thin, fragile, covered in that same handwriting. It began without preamble. "Maggie, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and maybe that makes it easier to say what I never could when I was alive and you were married to someone else. Maybe it doesn't. I've spent 60 years wondering if I should have fought harder. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. She set the letter down, unable to continue, and looked out at Harold's wild garden, at the life she'd lived in this house, in this town, as this person she'd become. And then she picked up the letter and kept reading. Because even at 78, even after a life fully lived, some part of her was still 18-year-old Maggie on a Carolina beach, believing in second chances. Chapter 2. Margaret read the letter 3 times before she trusted herself to stand up. Her coffee had gone cold, and Mr. Whiskers had given up on her for more promising ventures, probably the sun patch on the living room carpet. Jimmy's words were careful, measured. He'd written about his life, the architecture firm he'd built in Charleston, the buildings he'd designed that still stood along the waterfront. He'd married, had 2 daughters, been widowed young. He'd never forgotten her. That was the part that undid her, not said dramatically, just stated as simple fact, the way you'd note the color of the sky. I kept your letters, he'd written. All 47 of them, from that fall before you stopped writing. I've read them so many times I could recite them. You told me about the leaves changing in Pennsylvania, about starting at the business college, about your father's hardware store. You never mentioned Harold Fletcher until the letter where you told me you were engaged. Even then, you wrote like you were apologizing. I wanted to drive north right then to tell you not to do it. But I was 20 and broke and scared, and I told myself you'd made your choice. I was wrong about that. I don't think you chose anything. I think choice was something that happened to you, not something you got to make. Margaret folded the letter carefully and placed it back in its envelope. Her hands weren't shaking anymore. She felt strangely calm, the way she'd felt when the doctor told her about Harold's cancer. That odd sense of clarity that comes when the thing you've been dreading finally arrives. She looked at the legal letter again, reading the parts she'd skipped. There was more. Jimmy had left her something in his will. Not money, though there was some of that, but a house. The house where he'd lived in Beaufort, overlooking the water. Mr. Calloway was quite specific, the lawyer had written. The property is yours to do with as you wish. Sell it, keep it, visit it. He mentioned that you would understand why he wanted you to have it. She did understand. It was the house 3 doors down from where her aunt used to live, where Margaret had spent that summer supposedly helping with her aunt's new baby. The house that hadn't existed then. Jimmy had told her about wanting to build it someday, right there on that lot, with big windows facing the water. And he had. Margaret pulled out her phone, the smartphone Linda had insisted she learn to use, and typed slowly with one finger, Beaufort, South Carolina houses ocean view. The search brought up images of live oaks draped with Spanish moss, marshland at sunset, historic homes with wide porches. She clicked on a real estate link, then another. House prices made her blink. Even the modest homes were worth more than she'd paid for this entire property in Pennsylvania 40 years ago. The phone rang, startling her. Linda's face appeared on the screen, that feature she still wasn't used to. "Hi, sweetie," Margaret answered, hoping her voice sounded normal. "Mom, I was just thinking about you. How are you doing?" Linda called every morning, like clockwork. It was sweet and suffocating in equal measure. "I'm fine. Just having my coffee. Did you remember your pills?" "Yes, Linda." "And you're eating?" "Not just toast." Margaret looked at her plate with its toast crumbs. "I'm eating just fine." There was a pause. Linda had her mother's intuition, had been born with it somehow. "You sound strange. Is everything okay?" Margaret looked at the letters spread across her kitchen table, at the law firm's phone number printed neatly at the bottom of the page, at her whole life arrayed in this small kitchen, the refrigerator covered with grandchildren's artwork, the calendar marked with doctor's appointments and book club meetings, the pill organizer that had become her constant companion. Margaret. Linda only used her full name when she was worried. "I'm fine, honey. Really. Just thinking about some things." "What things?" "About the life I didn't live," Margaret thought. "About being 18 and in love and having that stolen from me. About whether it's too late to see where it all happened one more time." "Nothing important," she said. "How are the kids?" Linda launched into a story about soccer practice and spelling tests, and Margaret made the appropriate noises at the appropriate times. She'd gotten good at that over the years, being present while thinking about something else entirely. After she hung up, Margaret sat in the quiet kitchen for a long time. Then she did something she hadn't done in years. She went up to the attic. The pull-down stairs creaked under her weight. She climbed slowly, carefully, mindful of her hip. The attic was hot despite the September cool outside, stuffed with decades of accumulation. Christmas decorations, old tax returns, boxes of the kids' school papers that she'd meant to sort through but never did. In the far corner, under a sheet that had once been yellow and was now closer to gray, was her old cedar chest, the one her mother had given her before she married. "For your hope chest," her mother had said, though by then Margaret's hopes had already been packed away. She knelt down, a production at her age, and opened the lid. The smell of cedar and old fabric rushed out. On top were her wedding dress, carefully preserved in tissue paper, and Harold's Navy uniform. Beneath those were baby clothes, a christening gown, report cards. At the very bottom, in a shoe box she'd hidden there 60 years ago, were the photographs. Margaret pulled them out with trembling fingers. The colors had faded to that distinctive hue of old Kodachrome. Too bright, slightly unreal. But there she was, 18-year-old Maggie in a sundress, laughing at something off camera. Her hair was dark then, worn long down her back. She looked impossibly young and impossibly happy. And there was Jimmy, taller than she remembered, or maybe that was just the angle of the photograph. Dark hair falling over his forehead. That smile that had made her heart stop. There was one photograph of them together, the only one. They were on the dock, his arm around her shoulders, both of them squinting into the sun. They looked like they belonged together, like they were meant to last. Margaret stared at that photograph for a long time. Then she climbed back down the attic stairs, made herself a fresh cup of coffee, and called the lawyer's office in South Carolina. "This is Margaret Fletcher," she said when the secretary answered. "I received a letter from your office this morning about James Calloway's estate." "Oh yes, Mrs. Fletcher. Mr. Morrison has been hoping you'd call. Let me transfer you." While she waited on hold, Margaret looked out the window at Harold's wild garden, at the bird feeder she filled every morning, at the familiar landscape of her life. When the lawyer came on the line, she heard herself saying something she hadn't planned to say, words that seemed to come from some part of her that hadn't spoken in 60 years. "I'd like to see the house," Margaret said. "When would be convenient?" After she hung up, she sat very still. She'd done it. She'd actually done it. Mr. Whiskers jumped back onto her lap, purring like an engine. She scratched his head absently. "Well," she said to him, "I suppose I'm going to South Carolina." The cat purred louder, which she took as approval. Margaret picked up her phone again and pulled up Linda's number. Her finger hovered over the call button. Then she set the phone down. Some things, she decided, didn't need to be shared just yet. Some things needed to be just hers for a little while longer. She looked at Jimmy's letter again, at the careful handwriting of a man who'd spent his whole life drawing straight lines and building things that lasted. At the end, he'd written, "I'm not asking for anything, Maggie. I'm not haunting you from beyond the grave, asking you to regret the life you lived. I hope you were happy. I hope Harold was good to you. I just wanted you to know that you mattered. That summer mattered. You were the best thing that ever almost happened to me." Margaret folded the letter and held it against her chest. "You mattered too, Jimmy," she whispered to the empty kitchen. "You mattered too." Outside, the September sun climbed higher in the sky. The maple tree rustled in the breeze. Somewhere down the street, a lawn mower started up. And in her kitchen, Margaret Fletcher began making plans.